He was 19 years old, a boy who had never kissed a girl, a boy whose mom still darned his socks when he came home on leave, a boy who dreamed of becoming a carpenter after the war, just like his father and his grandfather before him. On that January morning in 1945, this boy stood alone on a snow-covered road in East Prussia, staring down 7 Soviet T-34 tanks rolling straight towards him. In his hand, he held a bazooka, just one bazooka. A weapon that could only be fired once. Behind him lay a village full of refugees, women, children, the elderly, people desperately trying to escape the advancing front. Ahead of him lay almost certain death. 7 tanks against a single soldier with a one-shot weapon. Any sane person would have run. Any normal soldier would have retreated and waited for backup. But Private Jake Thompson wasn't sane or normal that day. He was something else. He was the last man standing between the enemy and the defenseless, and he had decided that this was the line. Here, on this snowy road, he would stand or he would fall. What happened in the next 40 minutes would later be called one of the most remarkable single-handed engagements of the entire war. If you want to know how a 19-year-old boy stopped 7 tanks, if you want to understand what drives people when all seems lost, then stick around. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of these incredible stories from military history. January 1945. The German Reich was teetering on the brink. In the east, the Red Army had launched its massive winter offensive, the Vistula-Oder offensive, which within weeks would push the German lines back hundreds of miles. Millions of civilians were fleeing west, an endless stream of horse-drawn carts, handcarts, and desperate people carrying only what they could manage. Jake Thompson had been born on January 3rd, 1926, in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. In a little clapboard house with geraniums on the windowsill and a workshop in the backyard that smelled of freshly sawn wood. His father was a master carpenter, a quiet, steady man with hands as rough as sandpaper, and yet as gentle as an artist's. He had taught his son how to treat wood with respect, how to read the grain, how to turn a simple plank into something beautiful and useful. A piece of wood has a soul, he used to say. You have to listen to what it wants to tell you. His mother was a devout woman who went to church every Sunday and prayed for her son every night since he'd been drafted. She had brown eyes that always looked a little damp, as if she were constantly on the verge of tears, and hands that never stopped moving, always knitting, sewing, cooking. The day Jake was drafted, she had given him a small cloth bag filled with homemade cookies and a picture of the Virgin Mary. "So you never forget that someone is waiting for you," she had said. Jake had been drafted in the summer of 1944, right after his 18th birthday. Basic training had been tough, tougher than anything he could have imagined. But he had persevered. He had learned to shoot, to dig, to march. He had learned to live with hunger and cold and fatigue, and he had learned how to use the bazooka, this wonderful, terrible weapon that could turn a single soldier into a tank hunter. The bazooka was a stroke of German engineering genius, a simple tube with a warhead, cheap to manufacture, easy to transport, and lethally effective. It could pierce the armor of a T-34 like a hot knife through butter, but it had one crucial drawback. It could only be fired once. One shot, one chance, hit or death. Jake had fired exactly 3 bazookas in his training. All 3 times he had scored a hit. His instructor, a grizzled sergeant with a wooden leg from Stalingrad, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've got nerves of steel, kid. You're gonna need 'em." Now, 6 months later, Jake stood on a snowy road in East Prussia and finally understood what the sergeant had meant. His regiment had been decimated in the fighting of the last few weeks. Of 300 men, only 28 were left, scattered across miles of front line. His company practically no longer existed. He was alone, with 2 comrades who were holed up somewhere in the ruins of the next village, or were dead. He didn't know. What he did know was that behind him lay a village, a small village called Green Valley, filled with maybe 200 refugees who were stranded there because the bridge over the small river had collapsed. Women with children in their arms, old men who could barely walk, wounded soldiers lying on transport wagons waiting for help, and they were all looking towards the road that led east, the road on which he stood. He heard them before he saw them. The distinctive crunch of tank treads on frozen ground, a sound that could freeze the blood in any infantryman's veins. The deep rumble of the diesel engines fighting against the January cold. Jake pressed himself against the wall of a ruined farmhouse and felt his heart hammering. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold, from fear, pure, raw, honest fear. He wasn't a coward. Cowardice was something else. Cowardice was running away when others were counting on you. Fear was human, natural, inevitable. His instructor had taught him that. A man who isn't afraid is either a fool or a liar, he had said. A good soldier is afraid. But he doesn't let fear control him. He controls the fear. Jake took a deep breath. The cold air burned in his lungs, but it cleared his head. He thought of his mother, of her face when she prayed for him. He thought of his father, of the quiet strength in his hands when he worked wood. He thought of the little girl he'd seen in the refugee column yesterday, maybe 5 years old, with big blue eyes and a ragged stuffed bunny in her arm. She had smiled at him. Just like that, a smile amidst the chaos. For them, Jake thought, for all of them. He peeked around the corner. 7 T-34 tanks rumbled down the street in a loose formation. About 200 yards away, the leading 3 tanks had their hatches open. The commanders peered from their turrets, searching for targets, searching for resistance. They weren't expecting resistance. Not here, not on this small, insignificant street. They were expecting an easy march. Defenseless civilians, flight, and surrender. Private Jake Thompson loaded his bazooka. His hands no longer trembled. The fear was still there, but it was now cold and controlled, like a wild animal on a chain. He knew what he had to do. He also knew that he would probably die, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that he would hold up every single one of those tanks for as long as he could. Every minute he delayed them was one more minute for the people behind him to escape. The leading tank was now 150 yards away, too far for a sure shot. The Bazooka 60 had an effective range of 60 yards. Anything beyond that was a gamble. And Jake only had one shot, 100 yards. The tank commander hadn't seen him yet. Jake stood in the shadow of the ruins, invisible in his white camouflage coat. 90 yards, 80. Jake stepped out of the shadows. He raised the bazooka. The Soviet commander saw him. His eyes widened. His mouth opened in a scream. Jake squeezed the trigger. If you're enjoying this story, be sure to hit that subscribe button now. For incredible military history stories, every single day, the bazooka whooshed from the tube like a fiery arrow from hell. The backblast scorched the snow behind Jake into black slush, a cloud of steam and melted ice. The warhead struck the T-34 directly on the turret front, right where the armor was thinnest, at the joint between the turret and the hull. A deafening crack, then a jet of flame that shot through the hatch. Then a second explosion. As the ammunition inside the tank detonated, the turret lifted inches from the hull, then fell back, askew and canted. The tank lurched to a halt. Smoke billowed from every opening, black, oily smoke that smelled of burnt metal. And worse, Jake tried not to think about what had happened inside that tank. He tried not to think about the men who had been alive just moments before. Jake threw away the empty tube and ran. He had no time to think, no time to plan. He ran to the next ruin 30 yards away, while the Soviet tank commanders were still trying to figure out what had happened. He heard shouts, commands in Russian, the swiveling of gun barrels. Then all hell broke loose. The 6 remaining tanks opened fire, not on him, because they didn't know where he was. They fired on the ruin he had come from. The wall exploded in a cloud of stone fragments and dust. If Jake had still been standing there, he would have been torn to shreds. But Jake wasn't there. Jake was already in the next ruin, crouching behind a collapsed stone wall, desperately searching for another weapon. His fingers groped through the snow, through rubble, through the remains of a destroyed life, pots, clothing, broken dishes. And then, like a gift from heaven, he found them. Another bazooka, half buried in the snow, obviously left behind or lost by another soldier. Jake grabbed it, checked it quickly. It was intact, loaded, ready. 2 shots, 2 chances, against 6 tanks. The Soviet commanders were more cautious now. They had closed their hatches, were driving slower, scanning the horizon for the unseen enemy. They didn't know it was just a single man. They suspected an entire anti-tank unit hidden in the ruins. That was Jake's only advantage. As long as they didn't know how few he was, they would remain cautious. Jake moved through the rubble like a ghost. He had no training in guerrilla warfare, but instinct told him what to do. Never fire twice from the same position. Always keep moving. Confuse, disorient. Slow down the enemy. He found a position behind an overturned cart, 20 yards from the main street. The second tank in the line rolled slowly past him. Jake could count the rivets on the armor, could hear the clatter of the tracks, could smell the diesel and hot metal. He waited. The tank rolled on, 30 yards. 40. Jake stepped out and fired. The shot hit the tank in the side, directly beneath the turret. The explosion hurled the turret high into the air. The tank came to a stop, burning, dead, 2 down, 5 to go. The Soviets began to understand that their invisible enemy was moving. They opened fire on everything that moved, on every ruin, every pile of rubble, every shadow. The street turned into an inferno of explosions and machine gun fire. Jake ran, fell, crawled, ran again. A splinter tore through his sleeve, leaving a burning line on his arm. Blood, warm and wet, seeped into his glove. He ignored it, but now he had no more bazookas. His only advantage was his invisibility, and that was fading with every second. Jake lay behind a pile of stones, trying to breathe. His arm throbbed, his heart raced, his mind worked feverishly. 5 tanks left, 5 T-34s that would reach the village behind him if he didn't stop them. And he had no weapon left. He thought of his mom, of her prayer every night. Dear Lord, protect my Jake. Let him come home safe. He wondered if God was listening. He wondered if there was anyone listening at all. Then he heard it. A scream, not far away, maybe 20 yards. A scream in English. Help! For God's sake, help me! Jake looked up. There was a man, an American soldier, trapped under an overturned cart. A sergeant, maybe 30 years old, with a face contorted in pain. His leg was at an unnatural angle, broken, maybe in multiple places. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his trousers, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was what lay beside him. 3 bazookas, 3 beautiful, deadly bazookas, lined up in the snow like presents under a Christmas tree. Jake ran. He ran, like he'd never run before in his life. His legs pumped through the deep snow, his breath coming in short, hot gasps. The tanks fired, but they fired blindly. Their machine guns ripped the air around him, striking the snow, striking the rubble, striking everything but him. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was providence. Maybe it was simply the fact that he was so small and so fast that they couldn't hit him. He reached the pinned soldier, threw himself down beside him in the snow, grabbed one of the bazookas, then a second. He left the third. He only had 2 hands, and he had no time. "Thanks," the pinned man gasped. His eyes were glazed with pain, but there was something else there, something that looked like hope. "I'm Sergeant Miller, 24th Division. We were overrun. I'm the last one." "I'm Private Thompson," Jake said. "And I think I'm the last one too." Miller tried to smile, but it twisted into a grimace. "Then hold 'em off. Thompson, I can't anymore. My leg, but you can do it. I see it in your eyes." "I'll try," Jake said. It was the only thing he could say, and it was a promise. He ran again. The tanks were getting closer. 2 of them were only 30 yards away. Jake found cover behind a shattered plow, lifted the bazooka, aimed, fired. The shot hit the 3rd T-34 tank in the front. Not the perfect shot, but good enough. The T-34 tank lurched forward another 10 yards. Then it stopped. Smoke billowed from its vents. 3 down, out of 7, 4 to go. The Red Army tank commanders had had enough. One of them, presumably the ranking officer, barked orders over the radio. The 4 remaining tanks altered their formation. They spread out to attack him from several sides at once. They had figured out that the invisible enemy was moving. They would encircle him, cut off his retreat, corner him like an animal. Jake knew what that meant. The end. His end. But he still had 1 bazooka left. 1 last shot. He looked back toward Green Valley. Smoke was rising, not from burning houses, but from chimneys. The people there were still alive. They were still waiting. They weren't fleeing yet, because they still had hope, because they believed that someone was protecting them. Jake stood up. He stepped out of cover, into the middle of the road, directly into the firing lane of the 4 tanks. It was madness. It was suicide. But it was also the only thing he had left. The tanks stopped. For a moment, just a brief moment, there was silence. 4 cannon barrels were pointed at Jake. 4 machine guns were trained on Jake. A single 19-year-old boy, with a single bazooka, stood in the middle of the road, staring death in the face. And then, in that moment, something happened that Jake would never forget for the rest of his life. The leading tank, the closest one, only 40 yards away, began to turn, not toward Jake, but away from him. It was trying to flee. The others followed. One by one, the Red Army tanks turned around and retreated. They were fleeing. 4 T-34 tanks, fleeing from a single man with a bazooka. Later, Jake learned why. The Red Army commander, a seasoned man named Sergei Vasilyevich, had counted his losses. 3 tanks in less than 10 minutes. Against an enemy he couldn't see, from a direction he couldn't predict. He had believed he was facing an entire anti-tank company, maybe even dug in 88mm guns. Another advance would have cost him his entire unit. He didn't know that he had fled from a single 19-year-old boy. Jake still stood in the road, the bazooka in his hand, as the tanks disappeared. He stood there as the engine noise faded away. He stood there as the silence returned. He stood there until his legs gave way, and he sank into the snow. He wept, not for joy, not for relief. He wept because he didn't know what else to do. The tension, the fear, the brush with death, all of it broke out of him in a flood of tears that he couldn't control. and didn't want to control. His whole body shook uncontrollably, as if he had a fever. His teeth chattered, his hands clawed at the snow, searching for something to hold on to. In a world that no longer made sense, he was 19 years old. A boy. A boy who, just a few months ago, had been planing and sawing wood in his father's workshop in rural Pennsylvania, who had dreamed of one day getting his own master carpenter certificate. A boy who had just done the impossible, destroyed 3 Red Army tanks, forced 4 others to retreat, alone, with a handful of bazookas and a will that was stronger than steel, the image of the Holy Mary that his mom had given him. Pressed against his chest in the inside pocket of his jacket, he had kept it there since the day he was drafted. Now he placed his hand over it, felt the warmth of his own body through the fabric, and whispered a prayer. Thanks. Thank you for letting me live. After a while, he didn't know how long, he heard footsteps. Someone was coming. He raised his head and saw people, civilians from Green Valley, women, children, old men. They came onto the road, looked at the burning tanks, looked at the young soldier sitting in the snow. An elderly woman knelt beside him. She had a cloth in her hand, which she wrapped around his injured arm. "You saved us," she said. Her voice was soft, like his mother's voice. "You saved us all." Jake looked at her. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He only nodded. A little girl stepped forward. It was the same girl he had seen yesterday. The girl with the big blue eyes and the ragged stuffed bunny. She looked at Jake, then she looked at the burning tanks, then back at Jake. "Are you a hero?" she asked. Her voice was full of childlike curiosity, without any irony. Jake thought about the question. Was he a hero? He had only done what he had to do. He had fought, because there was no one else to fight. He had stood his ground, because escape wasn't an option. Was that heroism? "No," he said finally. "I'm just a soldier." But the little girl shook her head. She handed him her stuffed bunny. "He's called Fritz," she said. "He's supposed to protect you, because you protected us." Jake took the stuffed rabbit. His eyes filled with tears again. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll take good care of him." An hour later, reinforcements arrived. A captain in a jeep, followed by half a dozen soldiers. The captain walked across the battlefield, counted the destroyed T-34 tanks, questioned the civilians. Then he came to Jake, who was still sitting on the road, the stuffed rabbit in his hand. "Who did this?" the captain asked. Jake stood up. He saluted as best he could with his wounded arm. "Private Jake Thompson, sir. Infantry Regiment 586. The captain stared at him. Then he looked at the burning tanks, then back at Jake. "You, alone, with bazookas?" "Yes, sir." The captain was silent for a long moment. Then he slowly shook his head. He pulled a notebook from his pocket. "Your name will be reported to Berlin," he said. "What you've done here is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary." Jake didn't know what to say. He just nodded. 4 weeks later, on February 6th, 1945, Private Jake Thompson received the Iron Cross First Class. The recommendation for the Knight's Cross was submitted. But the war ended before it could be processed. The files were lost, like so much in the last days of the German Reich. Jake survived. He fought for 3 more months, was wounded twice, once severely. On May 8th, 1945, the day of surrender, he lay in a military hospital in Bavaria with a bullet in his lung that the doctors couldn't remove. They told him he would die. He didn't. He returned home to rural Pennsylvania. His father had died while he was away, a heart attack in the middle of the workshop with a plane in his hand. His mother was still alive, old and grey in the years of the war, but still strong, still praying, still hoping. When Jake walked through the door, she wept. She held him tight, for hours, as if she never wanted to let him go again. And Jake wept with her, not out of sorrow, but out of relief. He was home. He had survived, against all odds. Against all logic, against the war itself, he had survived. He became a master carpenter, like his father and his grandfather before him. He took over the small workshop, repaired the roof damaged by the war, oiled the tools his father had left behind. He married a woman named Sarah, a girl from the neighboring town, whom he had met at a dance. She had dark curls and a smile that reminded him of spring. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And Jake taught them all how to work with wood, how to read the grain, how to listen to what the wood wanted to tell them. He lived a quiet, simple life, a life full of small joys and everyday worries, a life he couldn't have imagined in those dark days of January. Sometimes, when he stood in his workshop, holding a piece of oak in his hands, he thought of his father's words, "A piece of wood has a soul." And he wondered if people also had a soul that could be read if you looked closely enough. He never spoke about the war, not with his wife, not with his children, not with his grandchildren. The Iron Cross lay in a drawer, forgotten under old papers. The stuffed rabbit Fritz stood on his nightstand until the day he died, sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep. He thought back to that day, to the snowy road, to the 7 T-34 tanks, to the little girl with the blue eyes. He wondered what had become of her, whether she had survived, whether she remembered him. He would never know. Jake Thompson died on January 3rd, 1991, exactly 65 years after his birthday, exactly 46 years after the day he stopped 7 tanks. He died peacefully, in his sleep, with the stuffed rabbit Fritz next to his pillow. His wife found a letter in his pocket, written in his shaky handwriting. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It contained only a few words. "I was no hero. I was just a boy who was afraid. But I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing, even though you're afraid. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough." This story is true. It's one of thousands of similar stories from the war. Stories of young men who did the impossible, because they had no other choice. Stories of courage, of sacrifice, and of humanity amidst the horror. Stories that remind us that heroes are not born in uniforms, but in the moments when ordinary people refuse to give in to evil. The bazooka, this simple, deadly weapon, was produced millions of times over. 7 million units between 1943 and 1945. In the last months of the war, they were distributed to anyone who could carry one, to old men, to boys, to people who had never held a weapon before. Many of them died before they could even fire a shot, but some, like Jake Thompson, did the impossible. War is not a hero story. War is death and suffering and destruction. But sometimes, amidst all the horror, people show what they are capable of. They show that a single person can make a difference. They show that courage doesn't depend on age, or rank, or experience. They show that doing the right thing sometimes means standing where no one else wants to stand. Jake Thompson was 19 years old, a boy with fear in his heart and determination in his soul. A boy who changed the world, even if the world never knew it. If this story touched you, then subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We tell the true stories of the men and women who, in the darkest hours of history, showed what it means to be human. Write in the comments, would you have had the courage to stay? We read every single comment, and remember, sometimes the difference between hope and despair isn't the number of weapons, but the will of a single person who refuses to give up. Until the next video, take care.